Good afternoon, everyone. I am Ellie Schlein, member of the European Parliament, a member of the S&D group. We apparently lost one of our speakers in the corridors, but in the meantime, I'm pretty sure we're going to be able to find him, and I think we should start so that we can be on time. First of all, let me thank you very much, the speakers of this panel and all the participants who are here for choosing this workshop on the European single market. I believe the subject of our discussion constitutes one of the crucial aspects of the current state of the debate on the future of the European Union, as well as a topic we cannot avoid within the wider discussion about post-growth that is addressed during this conference. The European single market, in fact, is one of the central pillars upon which the whole process of the European integration has been built. Since the signing of the Treaty of Rome in 1957, the main steps forward in the sense of a stronger integration have gone in the direction of a more and more unified market and the creation of an area of freedom among the member states. This process, at the same time, has constituted one of the most important factors behind the long and still persisting, we hope, period of peace the European community has ever known, and the European Union has been able to guarantee to its citizens. At the same time, I think the single market is far from being ideal, and many issues remain to be tackled, especially in the light of the growing economic inequalities, imbalances. And let's also remind that the inequalities have increased dramatically during these years of economic crisis. So I personally witnessed some of the persistent deficiencies of our internal market through our work inside the Committee on Financial Crimes, Tax Evasion and Tax Avoidance, and even before in the committee on the Inquiry Committee on the Panama Papers. Through my work, I've been able to realize not only how multifaceted is this issue, but also how much is still left to be accomplished in order to guarantee to the European citizen both a fully fledged European space of freedom and a European space where everyone can see his or her rights guaranteed with equal opportunities for a better life and a decent job and decent wages as well. So I think that if we want to reduce inequalities and guarantee equal opportunities, we should ensure tax justice, for example, strengthening the exchange of tax information and making individuals and multinational companies pay taxes where they make profit. In the last years, many steps have been made in this direction, but many still have to be made in the future. So in the recent crisis, we have learned the necessity to reinforce the overall frame of the single market, especially in the connection with the European Monetary Union, and to strengthen also the economic and political governance of the single currency. The question is our common currency enough to guarantee a fair and balanced functioning of the single market? Or is the single market balanced? Or again, should we also focus on the harmonization of our tax system, which today are still very different in the 28 member states of the European Union, in order to avoid a very dangerous race to the bottom and a very strong fiscal competition among member states of the same union? So I believe that a stronger single market should also rely on a stronger coordination between the countries in order to tackle more effectively economic crises as the one that recently hit our continent. This is also important in order to guarantee that citizens as well as small and medium enterprises are the real beneficiaries of the single market, and that the opening of the borders and the signing of trade deals do not go at their detriment, as it may appear so in some cases. I believe a fair share of the current mistrust toward the European Union derives also from the fact that citizens and enterprises are somehow skeptical vis-à-vis the benefits of our single market. But also, is everyone aware of the opportunities that the EU provides? This is another aspect that would be interested to go deeper in our debate with our guests. For all these reasons, I believe that it is of the utmost importance for our work in the years to come to strive both for a more complete and at the same time fairer single market, a single market which is able to guarantee a sustainable and inclusive growth for all our citizens, while promoting job creation, investments in research and a greener economic model. In this sense, besides the ones that I just mentioned, there are still many open questions when discussing about the European single market, and I'm glad to be able to participate in this panel and to hear from you about possible solutions to the above-mentioned problems. We will have the pleasure to discuss these and other issues with 4 high-level panelists, who I already thank for their availability and precious contribution to the debate. So we have here Mr. Joaquim Núñez de Almeida, Director of Single Market Policy at DG GROW at the European Commission, Ms. Gabi Bischoff, Special Advisor on European Policy Issues for the German Trade Union Confederation, as well as President of the Workers' Group at the European Economic and Social Committee, and Mr. Daniel Seikel from the Institute of Economic and Social Research of the Hans Böckler Foundation. Thanks for being here. We're waiting also for Mr. Jean-Christophe Defresne, Professor at St. Louis University. To sum up shortly the structure of the panel, you will have about 15 minutes for your presentation. The presentation will be followed by a moment of discussion with our guests today present in the room. And I would also like to recall the neutral theme of this discussion. I believe this is an essential element in order to have a real in-depth and constructive exchange between us. Finally, I would like to remind you that the entire panel will be live streamed and that it is possible to interact with the panelists also through Slido. For those who are not yet acquainted with this application, it is a very useful instrument for live commenting on the discussion, either from inside the room or outside this building, as we know that many people were interested in participating today to the panel, but unfortunately were not able to make it here today. In concrete terms, once you connect to the Slido website, you have to enter the following code, M781. 781 in order to be able to comment on this panel. Last but not least, in case you are Twitter users, I invite you to use the official hashtag of this conference, which is hashtag postgrowth2018. I thank you very much again for your participation to this panel, and I give the floor directly to the first panelist, which will be Joaquim Núñez de Almeida from the Commission. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm possibly suspect in this grouping in the sense that my Directorate General is called DG Growth. So I've got sort of obvious mandate reasons for which I'll have to be what I am. But, I mean, that also makes it possibly even more interesting. But the way I thought about, first of all, I was told that it was 5 to 7 minutes each presentation, so I'll probably be shorter than the 15 minutes. I hope that's not a problem, although we always have a tendency to speak a bit more than what we say we're going to speak. And I thought about approaching this by giving you a bit more data and about a bit more information about how we see the single market working right now. First of all, possibly the first thing to retain is that you've got big disparities in terms of density of EU regulation from area to area. For instance, there is incomparably more harmonization, more regulation on products and financial services than there are on services in general or transport or energy, which is not to say that there is not legislation. But the idea that the European economy is regulated in the same way by the EU, in the same sort of intensity by the EU, is not correct. I mean, there are big differences in the amount of EU legislation you find in different areas. Now, we're responsible for having put forward a legislative package on goods, because that's the area that I'm responsible for, product markets, goods, standardization, free movement of goods. And one of the interesting economic findings that we made in the impact assessment was the more you have harmonization, the more you have trade between member states, the more there is cross-border trade. Now, of course, we love cross-border trade. I'm not sure that all of you love cross-border trade, but so if you like cross-border trade, you think, well, the more there is EU legislation, the more there is trade. The figures were something like for 100 products internally consumed in a national market, there would be 55 being traded if the product is covered by harmonization, and only 19 if there is no harmonization. So harmonization, EU legislation, tends to boost trade. Secondly, I mean, and I've been responsible for various areas within the Commission. I haven't been working on the internal market all my life, but I have been quite a long time in the internal market. And since I've been approaching the EU matters, I mean, since like, let's say, the 80s, there's this very much always this idea that the internal market is yet to be completed. The internal market is not complete. The internal market is imperfect. I think that to a large extent this is always going to be like that, in the sense that we will never be at a point where developments have stopped and we achieve the level of legislative intensity that we would have liked, i.e. what happens is that you have new phenomena appearing that require legislation, that require political legislative solutions. Take, for instance, artificial intelligence or robotics. Nobody spoke about that 20 years ago. Life evolves. There are new things. You need new legislation. And then the question becomes, should that legislation be done at national level or at EU level? And again, there's a bit this issue of the more legislation you have at EU level, the more there's cross-border trade, but of course there are costs in terms of subsidiarity, because the more there is legislation at European level, the less there is legislation at national level and at local level. And so, you know, there's a bit here a bipolarity between, you know, if you privilege subsidiarity, you'd favor one. If you privilege cross-border trade, you'd privilege the other. There's also a point I'd like to make, is that we often are told, although I'm not sure, but we are often told that there's too much legislation, that legislation is very complex, you have to reduce legislation. But if there is no legislation, if there is no EU legislation, it doesn't mean that there is no EU law. It just means possibly that you have more case law, you've got more jurisprudence, and jurisprudence and case law are often more difficult to decipher even than legislation. So it's just to warn those of you that might prefer, you know, the absence of legislation, that the absence of legislation does not necessarily mean less EU, it means more EU law. It means more EU case law, it means more jurisprudence. And as I said, I mean, I'm not sure that an EU directive or regulation are more difficult to understand for a national administration or for a business than a case by the European Court of Justice. Another issue that we see increasingly in the evolution of the internal market is that increasingly the solutions are as much of capacity building, administrative quality, as of legislative solutions. So the solutions might often be the need to have resources of a certain quality at national level to make things work, rather than new laws. I mean, we have to make sure that when we do laws, especially laws tend to be quite demanding on our member states, that do they have the capacity to put these laws in force? Are there administrations at national level that can do these things? Do they have people to do these things? Do they have money to do these things? That's a question that I think increasingly pops up. I'd also point out that EU product harmonization often ends up, because of the commercial strength of the EU, to have an influence at world level, in the sense that our legislation ends up often by not being just our legislation, but a standard understood in the... What happens often is that the EU comes up with a rather demanding, in terms of health, safety, consumer protection, piece of legislation compared to other parts of the world. The EU is too important for global players not to sell in the EU, so they have to adapt to relatively demanding legislation. And that makes it that they press their own countries to adopt the same legislation so as not to be undercut by operators in the foreign place that do not sell in the EU. So like, you know, an Indian company that only sells in India and an Indian company that sells a lot in the EU, the Indian company that sells a lot in the EU will want India to have legislation similar to the EU so that the Indian company that doesn't sell in the EU is subject to the same conditions. Or there's a bit that pressure. The EU is often powerful as a result of its capacity to project legislative solutions at a world level. I also think that it is, and again, I'm not sure I'm going to make myself more popular by saying this, that there's somewhat of an imbalance between the completion and the density of the free movement of goods compared to the free movement of services. The EU is much more advanced on goods than services, so if your country relies more on industry and industrial production, it's probably better off than a country that relies on the export of its services right now. But, you know, things are what they are. And I'll stop here.
Thanks a lot for your contribution, Mr. Núñez de Almeida. And for sure there will be things to discuss also with the other panelists, but let me just give the floor directly to the second speaker, Ms. Gabi Bischoff, who is, again, as I said before, Special Advisor on European Policy Issues for the German Trade Union Confederation and President of the Workers' Group at the European Economic and Social Committee. Thanks for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good evening to everybody. Yes, indeed, maybe I'll just explain again what the Economic and Social Committee is. We are the neighbors next door. We are the House of Civil Society with 350 members from all 28 member states and divided in 3 groups. The first is the employers group, the second is the workers group. This is the group I represent as the president. And the third one is civil society organizations. It's called diversity, and our task is to give the EU institutions to help them in their lawmaking, to give joint recommendations on certain legal proposals. And we also have a lot of work done in the area now that also Mr. Almeida touched off. How do we achieve good regulation? And our job is to look from a practical perspective on proposals and to assess if they are sufficient, if they maybe are not necessary, or if we have concrete proposals, how to make them better. But all of this we do, and we give recommendations the institutions can take on board, the Commission, the Council, the Parliament, but they don't have to, unfortunately, until now. But I think this is very good, and I listened very carefully to Mr. Almeida because I think it's a good thing to have different views on the single market, and especially as we are living in a time where not only the single market but the whole European Union is at stake. And to see what element in this debate is the single market, for whom, yes, and for whom is it delivering, for whom is it maybe not delivering, and why, and how we can change this and improve this. So from a workers' perspective, and in my group are 120 trade union leaders from all member states, the workers assess the internal market as important. But on the other hand, we are absolutely convinced that it cannot function properly without a strong social dimension. And we were asked very early from Jacques Delors, when he was a Commission President, to deliver on how this social dimension could be established in the common market. And when we look at it, we can see that for us, the single market is not a means in itself. It is there to deliver for the people, and the assessment should also be, is this the case or not? We really assess it that currently the single market is not delivering for all. And we can see that, especially in the last 10, 20 years, that neoliberal policies have dominated the European policy and the agenda, and especially with the austerity policy and the consequences of this, also the assessment of the single market changed a lot. And we have to see that the social dimension was not established in the same pace. For example, when we look at the European semester. When it was established, there was no social assessment or anything included. And a lot of people perceive, for example, this European semester rather as an attack on their social welfare systems than something that helps to improve it and their living conditions. So therefore, it is very interesting to see that with this increase of poverty, of inequality, and again differences within and between the member states, and that we don't have the same living conditions, that the differences again are becoming bigger, that it's very important to see that we really have to change this and strengthen the social dimension. I think this was also the reason why the President of the Commission started this initiative on the social pillar. And it's an ongoing debate because we assessed the social pillar only as a door opener. Because it only opens the door that we can re-strengthen the social dimension and that we can integrate it in all policies, but also that we need concrete good legislation to do that. We identified, the pitfalls are very obvious. It's, for example, if you look at posting, if you look at this free movement of goods and services and also free movement of people, that we still have not a good enough legislation. The European Parliament, I think in this period, did a big step ahead to improve it, and this will be also important for workers all across Europe. But at the same time, I think for us, it is essential, and here I listened very carefully to you, Mr. Almeida, and I share the opinion of DG Growth, that a good legislation is important, and that also we need good and clear legislation, that if you have a selection of case law, it doesn't make the situation any better. But at the same time that we were quite critical with these initiatives on the Commission on better regulation and refit, that this narrative that less regulation is better, in our view, goes totally in the wrong direction, but to see how can we achieve good legislation. And for us, one of the key problems in the single market is that we have quite a set of social regulation, but because the member states wanted more and more exemptions in the last years, a lot of this legislation is a bit like a Swiss cheese. It has a lot of holes in it, and that makes it easy for certain groups and companies to exploit these loopholes in the legislation. So we would support to say, yes, we support the single market. It is important if it delivers for all and if it delivers quality jobs with good pay and with a good protection. And I think it is time now, especially when we look at the next Commission, this one will just finalize some of the work they did. They gave it a new impetus, but the real work will start and has to start with a new Commission and a new Parliament to regain the trust of the citizen and really deliver on a single market that serves all and not only the few. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And of course I share many of the things that you have just said, but I will leave the debate for afterwards together with our guests, and I will give immediately the floor to our first speaker, Mr. Daniel Seikel from the Institute of Economic and Social Research of the Hans Böckler Foundation for about 10 to 15 minutes, if you want.
Yes, thank you for the kind introduction. I see the presentation is working. So also hello from my side. As you all can see, the title of the presentation is Rebalancing Economic Freedoms and Social Rights, and this is quite also the program or the programmatic title of what I'm going to tell in the next few minutes. From a social perspective, in the broadest sense of the word, two basic things can be said about the single market. First, the purpose of the single market, of course, is to create economic growth and employment. And this is obviously very important from a social perspective because economic prosperity not only provides the vast majority of European citizens with a decent income, but also because economic prosperity is the source for the financing of public services and social security systems via the collection of taxes or social contributions. So, but the second important point from a social perspective is more a downside, and this is the following. Fostering economic growth via the strengthening of economic freedoms, and this is the basic philosophy and logic of the single market, is quite in a difficult relation with social rights. And the reason for this is that social rights are market-correcting institutions which by nature restrict economic freedoms. And you see you have quite a fundamental tension between both. So in general, the balance between economic freedoms and social rights cannot be one of a positive sum game. There's always a trade-off. However, despite this trade-off, this does not imply that you cannot combine economic freedoms and social rights or balance them in a way that they produce very well-performing economic systems. And we have a lot of countries in the EU that are examples for this very smart mixture of both. These are countries that have high social standards throughout the economy. They have very generous welfare systems, and still they belong not only to the richest, but also to the most competitive countries in the world. So the message here is there is a trade-off between economic freedoms and social rights, and you cannot maximize on both ends of this trade-off. But nevertheless, the question is how to balance both. You see, in every political economy, the key question is how to balance economic freedoms and social rights. And the single market is no exception in this regard. My point, the point of this presentation is that the single market has not solved this question in an optimal, satisfactory way, and also that the balance is biased towards economic freedoms. So, and in the following, you're going a bit too quickly with the presentation. I cannot. Yeah, to the agenda, please. Okay, I just try to better communicate with you. Okay. So in the following, I will explain why I think there is a bias, and also I will make two concrete suggestions how economic freedoms and social rights can be rebalanced. Now I give a signal. No, please. No, the second slide. This one, yeah. So this is the agenda of my presentation. First, I just want to briefly explain that from the primacy of trans-border mobility of productive factors that arise two specific problems, and then I will give you two options how these problems can be addressed before I briefly summarize. Okay, now comes the next slide and immediately the next slides. I'm sorry for, Okay, so European law establishes the primacy of cross-border mobility of production factors, and this is basically the 4 fundamental freedoms: goods, capital, services, and persons. So these are really the core elements of the single market. From this primacy of cross-border mobility arise 2 problems, and the first one is, and that might sound quite technical, but is indeed quite an important development. You see, originally the founding fathers and mothers of the European Union had created the 4 fundamental freedoms as general prohibitions of discrimination on the basis of nationality, so the principle of non-discrimination. But the European Court of Justice, already starting in the 1960s and 70s, has reshaped the fundamental freedoms, has changed the meaning of the fundamental freedoms. And the court has turned the fundamental freedoms from general prohibitions of discrimination to general prohibitions of restriction of intercommunity trade. And you might notice that this is quite a difference if you say we don't want to discriminate or if we don't want to restrict economic activities across borders. The consequence of this evolution is that any national regulation that has the potential to restrict one of the 4 fundamental freedoms has to, in practice, has to withstand a very restrictive test of proportionality. And this is known as the Gebhardt formula. It, again, might sound very technical, but I just will explain you what the Gebhardt formula says. It says a restriction of a fundamental freedom is only justified when it kind of survives a 4-stage test. Then there are 4 questions that have to be answered. A restriction of the fundamental freedom is justified first when it is applied in a non-discriminatory manner. This is the non-discrimination principle. Second, it is justified by imperative requirements in the general interest. Third, it is justified if it is suitable for securing the attainment of the objective the measure pursues. And fourth, it does not go beyond what is necessary to achieve the objective. So this might, again, sound very technical, but is quite important because it shows that the test a market-correcting institution has to survive is quite imbalanced. It's quite biased towards the fundamental freedoms. Why is this the case? Well, you see, the logic here is if you have a market-correcting institution that by nature restricts economic freedoms, there is a test. The other way around, if there is a fundamental freedom in economic freedom that restricts a social right, there's no test. No one asks a 4-stage no one has a 4-stage test to test this economic freedom. And this is especially a problem in the area of collective labor law. And by this I mean the autonomy of collective bargaining, the right to strike and co-determination. There are some problematic cases from the European Court of Justice that have restricted, for example, the right to strike. Maybe some of you have heard of those cases, Laval, Ruffert, Luxembourg, and Viking, that have in comparison with other cases from the ECJ, these have become quite famous. Okay. Coming to the second problem. And this problem is rooted in the principle of mutual recognition or the country of origin principle. I think I don't have to explain this principle here to this audience. Thank you. Basically, in a this principle of mutual recognition becomes a problem because of the simple fact that the European Union is a space that is very, very heterogeneous in terms of socio-economic and institutional factors. So we have very differently organized economies. We have highly diverse social welfare systems, not only in terms of their generosity, but also in the way how they are financed, how social rights are distributed, and so on and so forth. And the problem that arises in such a setting is that we have regulative competition between member states that can put social standards under pressure. This can happen in the areas of wages, social benefits, labor market policy, or as has been mentioned in the beginning, also in the area of tax competition, which is a prime example of regulative competition. And this mechanism is quite an indirect mechanism that works much in a Hayekian way via markets and competition. Okay, now, how can these problems be tackled? Okay, and I have two, I'm going to present you two possible solutions, which each address one of the problems. The first one addresses the first problem, so the conflict between social market-correcting institutions and economic freedoms. And the idea here is to restrict the reach of fundamental freedoms. There are different proposals on the table that more or less address this very problem. The first one is a very far-reaching proposal that has been tabled by Dieter Grimm, a former judge of the German Federal Constitutional Court, and the idea is the deconstitutionalization of single market law. So the logic is that first you have to create a European constitution that is really a true constitution, so something that is devised as a constitution and with this contains all the elements that should be in a constitution, so provisions about institution, competences, procedures, political rights, social rights, but everything else that is not usually contained in a constitution should be transferred to secondary law. So basically the acquis communautaire, the single market law, then becomes secondary law and would lose its constitutional status. But this, of course, is a really far-reaching reform proposal which would change, would require a total overhaul of the institutional architecture of the European Union. And it has also other elements that should improve democratic policy making and so on and so forth. But I will not go into detail much more here. The second proposal is a proposal that has been tabled by the trade unions, the European Trade Union Confederation, and this is the idea of a social progress protocol. And here the basic philosophy is that you establish a hierarchy between economic freedoms and social rights that in case of conflict between both would subordinate economic freedoms under the primacy of social rights. So that would also require a treaty change. The next two proposals are basically the same. The question here is only at which level of law they should be implemented. And the idea here is to introduce exception clauses into the treaties, and I will come in a second to this in more detail. So, the idea is that you introduce areas of exception into the provisions about the four fundamental freedoms and also in the area of competition law, so the very core elements of the single market. And the formulation of these areas of exception or these exception clauses would be like the following. Oh, you are a bit too fast. Sorry. The next? That's it. Thank you. So the formulation would be like this. Restrictions resulting from national collective bargaining law, collective agreements or collective actions, including measures and collective agreements against transnational wage competition, are excluded from the scope of application of the provisions. So this is really targeting the problem, the first problem, and especially targeting the problem, the conflict between economic freedoms and collective social rights in the area of collective labor law. Okay, the second problem, which is then at the next slide, exactly, is the idea of social minimum standards. And this targets the problem of regulative competition. And the basic idea is that you put a ratchet to regulative competition. So I can look at this, okay. Yeah, you politically, democratically define a certain level below which no competition takes place. You take a certain area out of regulative competition. And you can do this in different ways. And one is that you establish relative instead of absolute standards. And the example I give you is the idea of a minimum wage. But the idea is not to say a minimum wage in the EU should be 10 euros per hour for every country, but a norm that says every country should implement a minimum wage of about 60% of national median wage. This is just a proposal. I mean, the level is, of course, open to discussion. And with the same philosophy, you could also establish minimum replacement rates for all sorts of social policies. So, for example, for social assistance, unemployment benefits, and pensions. And following an idea of Klaus Busch, this should best be done in a corridor model. This is how he named it. And here the idea is that it's quite difficult for all countries to have unified standards, so you cluster countries. You build different groups of countries according to their economic performance, according to the generosity of their welfare systems, and then they have different levels of standards, but you at the same time implement a mechanism that over time produces upwards convergence. And you could think, of course, of other kind of minimum standards for co-determination or in the area of taxes, again, where you could at least partially harmonize corporate taxes, for example, which is also the idea of minimum standards. Okay, to conclude, my main message is there is a trade-off between economic freedom rights and social rights, and the question is how these should be balanced. The second message was that there is a primacy of cross-border mobility of production factors. This is the soul of the single market, and that this primacy causes specific problems. And then I have given you two possible solutions of how these problems can be tackled. The first one was the idea of restricting the reach of fundamental freedoms via exception clauses in order to strengthen collective social rights. And the second proposal was the establishment of social minimum standards that put a floor to regulative competition. Okay, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Seikel, and thanks also for providing us with very concrete proposals, also to have something to discuss in the following debate. But the very good news is that we found our fourth speaker. We were worried about you, actually, because
I was delayed by the security of the Parliament for a while.
I'm sure that it's not because of your ideas, so I will be happy to introduce you once again, Mr. Jean-Christophe Defresne, professor at St. Louis University. You will now have the floor as well for about 10 to 15 minutes to present us with your ideas. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much for inviting me. If you remember the Treaty of Rome, the common market was based on an assumption that if you had freedom of capital mobility, if you had freedom of mobility of labor, that would lead to a kind of convergence within the EEC at that time. The idea was the law of diminishing return of capital and labor, and through movement of labor or capital, interest rates would equalize and progressively wages would equalize. And that was the assumption based on the dominant economic theory at the time, Esch-Caroline-Samuelson models and different approach that thought that market mechanism alone could create convergence. So when Italy, the poorest member state of the EU in 1958, joined, there was a substantial gap. The GDP per capita was about 63% of the EU average at that time. And after more than a decade, the EU Commission realized that convergence was not automatic. The south of Italy, Mezzogiorno, did not progress. Some people came then with the idea of having a regional policy and structural funds, supported by the UK as they entered the EU in 1973. But still, of course, the means and the financial capacity of the Union was, of the EEC at that time, was very limited. So these structural funds could not actually match the capacity of federal states like the United States or modern China, who can actually help the lagging behind region to catch up more easily. In Europe, you begin to have two, I would say, concepts. One where you needed state intervention to try to help those lagging behind, and others who still believe that the mechanism of the market would make this automatic convergence happen. I must say that with time, it is not obvious at all. Modern economic theory has now included new concepts such as Marshallian districts, what you call business clusters. And this was first, I would say, publicized at a large scale in the 1990s by Paul Krugman, who wrote an article just after the Treaty of Maastricht to show that despite the fact that you were moving towards more integration and less obstacles to the movement of capital and the removal of exchange rate uncertainty with the adoption of the common currency, despite these removals of obstacles which would free the movement of labor, services and capital and goods, this will not lead automatically to convergence. The idea is that, of course, you have business clusters that can actually concentrate high value-added activities. The most obvious example is Silicon Valley. And these can actually create many mechanisms. First, capital can stay in these high-tech business clusters and will not automatically go where there is a scarcity of capital, that is in less developed parts of Europe. You have similar examples of high-tech Marshallian districts, high-tech business clusters in Europe. There is not only Silicon Valley. You have the Bordeaux-Toulouse area for the aeronautics. You have the Bio Valley for the pharmaceutics between Freiburg, Mulhouse, and Basel in Switzerland. You have the Marshallian district of the City of London. You have Frankfurt. You have Paris. All this area concentrate high value-added activities, whether in high-tech or advanced technological services like finance or knowledge-based services. So what you have in Europe, if you look at the localization of these high-tech Marshallian districts, it's mostly in Northwest Europe. And the effect of that is that if you consider these phenomena, it means that countries from the periphery of Europe in a single market that removes more and more obstacles will create brain drain from the periphery back to the center. If you're a highly educated person from Romania in finance, you're not going to stay in Romania, you're going to go to London. And if you're highly educated engineers from the south of Portugal in aeronautics, you're probably going to apply to Bordeaux or Hamburg to work on Airbus, but you're not going to stay in Portugal. And that, of course, if you follow Krugman's hypothesis, means that a higher integration of the single market can actually create more disparities between different regions of Europe. At the same time, something also changed. With the different enlargement, first with the Mediterranean in the 1980s, Greece, then Spain and Portugal in 1986, I would say, of course, the divergence, the disparity of GDP per capita was higher. The level of productivity difference was higher. Spain, compared to Italy, as I told you, when it joined, was about a GDP per capita of 63%. When Spain and Portugal joined, their GDP per capita were only 50% of the average. And by the 2004 enlargement, the average of the 10 new member states who joined, from Eastern Europe mostly, was only 25% of the GDP of the EU average. And at the same time, the latest enlargement, per capita, there was actually less structural funds given per capita to Eastern Europe, while the gap was bigger than with Spain and Portugal. This, of course, I would say, is something which is very difficult to discuss in Brussels for many years. I think that there was a will to believe market forces could do it alone. And there was some convergence of some countries. One of the examples that was often quoted was Ireland, which started well below the average, but through the Celtic Tiger model, which attracted a lot of multinational enterprise, they managed to move above the average. I will briefly show you some figures about Ireland to tell you that it's not such a nice story, because there is a difference between the GDP per capita and the income by household, due to the difference of repatriation of profits by US multinationals there, or the fact that a lot of the statistics of GDP in Ireland are highly contestable. I don't know if you recall, but in 2015, the GDP increased by 27% in Ireland, which Paul Krugman called leprechaun economics, because mostly it was a game of accountancy made by American multinationals who wanted to benefit from the tax regime of Ireland by moving intellectual property rights, patents, or sometimes brands to Ireland without creating actually any more gains of real investment technology and so on. I'm not saying, of course, that the growth of Ireland is totally artificial. There is clearly a real growth that took place. But what I'm saying is that it is the growth that was very dependent on foreign multinational. And when you look at the level of technological development of Ireland, it's not so impressive. Ireland spent in GDP less than the average of the EU. It spent about 1.7%. The EU is at 2%. And it's very dependent on actually a handful of companies. So I'm talking about 10 American companies. If they move away, when Dell decided to relocate from Ireland to Poland in 2005, that was a loss of 5% of the GDP for Ireland alone. So I would say that the Irish example is often quoted as an example that you can succeed through market, but it's a very exception. Ireland is a tax haven for multinational enterprise. It is close to the US because it's the shortest flight you can get from Boston and New York. It was mainly for high-tech and pharmaceutical and electronic firms and computer firms that moved into Ireland. This model will not be replicated by Greece, Bulgaria, or Portugal with the same facility, as they don't speak English. They are larger countries. If you take Romania or Poland, they have a population of 30 or 40 million people. Ireland had only a population of 5. So the kind of attracting FDI is much more easy if you're a small economy, as Singapore or Luxembourg has proven, especially when you combine the attraction with the tax haven facilities. So what you have is a model that was put forward, but I don't think it was very replicable. Something that also changed. And this is where you have to also think not only inside a single market, but within the international division of labor. In the 1990s, many countries from the developing world opened to FDI and multinational. Mexico entered into NAFTA with the United States. Countries from Southeast Asia, the ASEAN, welcomed Japanese investment. Eastern Europe opened up largely to multinational. And that created a globalization of production networks. Do I still have?
Yeah, sure.
So this globalization of production networks has totally transformed the way that firms operate and produce. If you look at Volkswagen, they are not producing everything in Germany like they used to in the 1970s. They are actually dividing the different tasks of production across different member states according to their respective comparative advantage. For example, Volkswagen can put its financial coordination center in Brussels to benefit from some tax exception, at the same time assembling in Slovakia, but doing the research and development in Germany. And what I mean here is that in this international division of labor, not all the countries have the same role and the same growth prospects. If you are hosting R&D activities or financial activities, you are hosting high value added activities which can create clusters and Marshallian districts that we are talking about. If you are specializing only in the assembly, you are creating Marshallian districts. There is a Marshallian district in the assembly of cars in Slovakia, There is a Marshallian district in some parts of Italy in textile, but this is not high-tech. This is actually low-tech, with low value, low productivity, low prospect of technological development. The only problem is that it's not only a problem that, of course, the technological prospects of each member states are going to be different according to where the high-tech Marshallian districts are located. There's also a problem because in the world economy, there are other players who also have specialized in some of these Marshallian districts. To give you an idea, today Renault is subcontracting some activities to Turkey to make car equipment using the custom unions that we have with Turkey since 1996. And it's actually very good because some of the firms from Turkey, like Oyak, are actually not such bad provider of equipment. Renault is quite happy to use them, Peugeot as well. But the problem is that the wages in, of course, Turkey are not the same as in other member states, and Turkey is getting a bit more high-tech than before. Turkey can now manufacture. So can Thailand and Mexico and Morocco with the Tangier Mediterranean area, which also hosts Renault activity in the car industry. And it's an opportunity for these countries to, upgrade their capacity in manufacturing and exporting. The problem is that these countries still have quite low wage compared to the EU, and especially even the periphery of the EU. When I'm talking about the periphery, I'm talking about the poorest countries like Romania. And I'd like to show you here a bit some figures to show you that for the periphery of Europe, the problem is not only that they lag behind the most advanced member states who hold the best Marshallian districts, high-tech clusters, but it's also that they're facing competition from emerging economies who are now technologically as advanced or even more advanced than them. Figures show that for Greece, for Romania, for Portugal, even for Italy, this is going to be a very tough evolution because their part in the global division of labor is not actually sustainable. They're not high-tech enough and they still have high wages and welfare. And since the crisis of 2008, the disparity has been growing and convergence has stopped in many different aspects. So I'm going to show you, if I've got still 5 minutes. Okay, I'd like to show you one or two. Here you can see, well, just first, this is, of course, a group of children from Beijing in the pollution. The next slide is also Beijing. Oh, the next slide is actually not so much Beijing. Do you recognize that? That's Poland. The next slide is Bulgaria. And I wanted to show you here the world deadliest countries for air pollution according to the World Health Organization, showing that actually Lithuania, Romania, Poland, Croatia, and Bulgaria are in the top, and they are among the side of China. This is to tell you these are developing world standards in terms of environment. If you pollute that much, it means that you have actually a very low technology in many aspects. So let's look another slide to have a bit more data. Convergence, if you look at the GDP per capita, has slowed down for a lot of countries since 2008. I'm not, I don't have the time to go into all the different states. So there are countries who are converging. I think, for example, the Czech Republic is doing quite well compared to others. But if you look at countries like Greece, Romania, some Baltic countries, they're clearly not converging anymore since 2008. And according to some calculation, they will not converge for the next 70 years at this rate. So that's to give you when we talk about different social disparity, difference in wages, difference in productivity, difference in capacity to attract high value-added activities, the gap is still widening for some countries. Next slide, please. Though here I would like to look just at the R&D spending compared to the GDP. And here you have the statistics for actually a couple of years to show you the evolution before the crisis, 2005, and just at the moment of the crisis, and then in 2016, the latest figures you can have. You can clearly see that countries like Romania, Poland, or Latvia are now well behind China when they used to be at the same level only 10 years ago. China is now spending about 2% of its GDP on research and development. That is including foreign firms located in China, but it's the same for Romania and Poland. That is including German or French firms located in Romania or Poland. But you can clearly see that while there is a tendency, very clear, by the most advanced countries like Germany or Sweden or France to try to move up, or Finland to move up and follow South Korea, the countries from the periphery are not moving very fast. Italy has moved a little, but if you look at Italy, they are now spending far less proportionally to their GDP than China. Can I have the next slide, please? Then, if you look at R&D spending in current euros, the situation is even worse because for countries like Hungary or Greece or Portugal, the contraction of the GDP was so high during the crisis that actually the absolute amount of research spending is actually falling and not increasing. But clearly you can see that there was some progress for Portugal and Hungary until 2008, but the latest figure you have for 2013 and 15 are extremely worrying. Look at countries, of course, for Greece, which has a much bigger size than Estonia in terms of population. I mean, these are developing country standards. The next slide, please. So I'd like also to look you the different levels of patents per capita. How much patents are created per capita? You can really see the technological divide of Europe here between Northwest Europe, countries like France and Sweden, or the low countries, the Netherlands, and compare that with Bulgaria, Romania, but even countries like Greece or Portugal, you are clearly not in the same league. Actually, the South and Eastern Europe have characteristics not even of emerging economies, but below that. Can I have the next slide, please? Royalties per capita tells you about the same story. There is a difference for Hungary because Hungary has a special tax regime to have royalties declared in Hungary, but I think it is more a fiscal reason than an high-tech reason given the amount of R&D spending by Hungary. And the next slide. Yeah, this is to show you how much the innovation is local. And if you look at countries like Denmark, most of their innovation is local. But if you look at countries like Romania or Latvia, you will see that actually most of the innovation is made by foreign firms. So they are highly dependent on foreign firms who could locate elsewhere, especially in a very integrated market. Can I have the next slide? Yeah, well, that's the same, so please, the next one, yeah. I also wanted to tell you a bit, this is the number of universities in the Times Higher Education ranking. You have the figures here in the top 300 and in the top 100 in yellow. Well, then you can see that, Sweden is doing fantastically well. They have a very small population and they're doing as much as China. For Italy, the situation is not that good compared to South Korea or to Germany. And you can see clearly that, again, there is a gap. When you look at Romania, Poland, and Greece, they have not a single one in the top ranking. So if you look at the number of national firms that belong to the global 500 firms ranked by Fortune, again, you can see the fantastic rise of China due to the industrial policy of China. Many of these firms are state-owned and subsidized by China. But if you look at Italy, it's actually declining over the last 15 years. It's not the case of France and Germany, who are increasing, and that's due mostly to the merger and acquisition they do in other member states as well. But if you look at Portugal, Romania, and Poland, Poland has only one, and it's in the energy sector. It's a highly regulated and government-sponsored industry. So I would say, but it doesn't show this big firm from Poland is only investing in the two neighboring countries, so it's not really a multinational enterprise. So you can really see with these kind of different figures the technological gap, the fact that many member states do not have the capacity to create global firms that are able to control the global production network, but they just some of the member states from Eastern and Southern Europe can mostly host multinational enterprise, but usually in labor-intensive activities rather than high-tech intensive activities. And the gap is actually not being reduced, and it's getting problematic because in the international competition, there are many emerging economies who are now catching up with some of these peripheral member states. I could quote about 20 countries from the emerging world who are actually now doing as much in R&D as parts of Italy, Portugal, the Baltic countries, or the Romanian, Bulgarian, and so on. So this is to tell you that market forces on their own in a very integrated single market will not automatically create convergence, and that with the globalization that is here to stay and the position of the EU, which I believe is a better one than the one of Trump, that is trying to keep multilateralism and open trade, it's going to be very difficult for these peripheral countries to find their place in the international division of labor, because they specialize in exactly the same thing as emerging economies, who have much less welfare state, much lower wages. And so that's, I think, a real challenge. And so far, the states from Northwest Europe have thought that, we don't need any budget for that. But if you look at the history of change in the US or China, this is not what's happening. I had an argument with here at the Parliament on the Lisbon strategy, the assessment of the Lisbon strategy a couple of years ago, and a CDU, I think, parliamentary MP was saying, but California used to do oranges in the 1930s, and no Silicon Valley. So you can move from low-tech to high-tech with market forces. But if you look at the story of Silicon Valley, it's federal government spending who creates Silicon Valley through the World War II and through a major military program. And it's not totally market-driven at all. It is both. It is with a very big government incentive over 40 years. And if you look at what the Chinese are doing, for example, the solar panel industry in China, totally created with government subsidies, incentive, and industrial policy. In Europe, we don't have an industrial policy because we have a competition policy. But in the US or in China, industrial policy can be also used sometimes to develop marshalling districts in places where they did not exist. And if these marshalling districts are not created by the state, at least there is some kind of financial compensation through the tax system. The federal government of the United States is using the tax contribution to help the states who do not have so much high-tech marshalling district. And of course, the government of China is organizing massive financial transfer from the eastern province to the western province because it's fully aware of these problems of marshalling districts. In Europe, we look to be the only one who do not realize this problem. And it's very obvious. The brain drain is visible if you look at the statistics of graduates from Romania, from Italy, from Spain, from Portugal. They are moving north or they're moving to the United States. But it means that the technological basis of the south and eastern part of Europe is actually weakening since the crisis of 2008. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot. And that would conclude the intervention of our panelists, but let's move to the most exciting part of the panel of today, the discussion with you. So I would open the floor. You have heard many different views and ideas, some very concrete proposals on what way forward. I would be very interested to give the floor to any of you who might have a question or also a comment on the intervention that you heard. Who's Yeah, we have a first intervention there. The floor is yours.
Yeah, Christian Felber, Economy for the Common Good. I have a kind of double question to Mr. Seikel and his thoughts and reflections and analysis on the tests of new legislations. And I would like to start with an anecdote from Bhutan. Bhutan was in front of the decision to join the World Trade Organization. And first there was a discussion between economists and economic consultants and the government, and they said that the per capita income would rise, and the GDP would rise, and the trade volume would rise, and of course we joined the World Trade Organization. And then they applied, made what the European Commission would call a sustainability assessment of the political decision. And the happiness assessment of that decision had the result that the entrance into the Free Trade Organization would lower all social standards. It would lower all well-being indicators. It would lower cultural diversity and ecological standards, and would pose a greater risk to democracy. So the tests were not in favor of economic freedoms, but to protect everything else. And the result was that the government decided not to enter the World Trade Organization. I'm coming back to the European Union. There was a sustainability assessment from the European Commission on CETA, the trade agreement with Canada. And although I think that the general impact on climate, biodiversity, and everything else would be clearly negative, because it said that especially trade in agricultural products would increase dramatically, there was no red light at all against CETA. So my first question is, what again would have to change that the European Union would submit the political decision to join an external trade agreement, but could be the same something within the single market, to these other criteria? You already started to develop it, but what would have to change? Also considering that one day there might be a constitutional part of the European treaties and a secondary part. We do have the Treaty of the European Union, which could be considered as a kind of a constitutional part, and then we have the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, which could be considered everything else. And my second question is that the constitutional part, the Treaty of the European Union, already includes these criteria that I think and we share and that are meaningful tests for any political measure. And I just quote some of them. And again, with the example of CETA, and the Treaty of European Union says that that there are principles and objectives of the Union's external action, for the Union's external action, part of which the trade policy is. Means these principles and objectives are valid for external trade agreements, and the principles are: promote multilateral solutions, CETA is bilateral. Promote in particular agreements within the United Nations, CETA is not. Integrate all countries in the world economy, CETA disintegrates African and Latin American countries from world economy. Preserve peace. Weapon trade with weapons is not excluded, exempted as far as I know. Foster sustainable environmental development. We have a negative impact. And eradicate poverty. As far as I know, there is no binding and suable provision to protect people from falling into poverty thanks to CETA. The second question is, actually we already have this test in the primary treaty, but it's not implemented. And the question is, why is it not implemented, and what is missing that this kind of principle, an overarching principle for the more important constitutional part, can be used to evaluate policy measures both for the single market or for, in my example now, is an external trade agreement.
Thanks a lot. Other questions or comments? Yes.
Hi. Hello. I'm sorry I was not here from the beginning, so I don't know exactly what the framing of this was, but it did not seem like a degrowth.
Could you please introduce
I'm sorry.
yourself,
Yes,
and
of
then
course.
if you have a specific question, also tell us for whom.
Okay. So my name is Guilherme. I live here, as in, yeah. Yeah. The question is for everyone. I came here for like a degrowth, like a post-growth conference, so I thought we would debate how do we go about going into the future of a planet, like planetary limits, and how can we use the European marketplace so that we can, foster those solutions, think multilaterally, serve global stakeholders, because I live here, we all live here. Instead, I heard praisings of growing, government-led or private-led. The focus is always on growth, and I'm just wondering, did I miss something? I really thought that we were coming here to we're concerned, and there's no. I don't see any. Maybe it was just me, but I didn't hear any ideas to how do we not grow and still go forward? How do we degrow in a kind of a manageable way? I'm not talking only about equality in growing. I'm talking about put carbon caps or limit wage differences. There's a lot of ideas outside, and it was just weird, and so it's just a general question, because I might have missed it. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. I will gather all the questions, and then we can do a round to answer with all the speakers. Okay, yes.
A question for Mr. Diamela. You were talking about the US.
Yes, it's better.
So
we are on streaming as well, so it's better to have the mic.
Yeah. Well, you finished your, if I call it a lecture, with an imbalance between the attention and profits, between goods and services, if I correct me if I'm wrong. And I was wondering how you came to that conclusion, and what do you propose something to do about it, and what is that proposition then? Thank you.
Thanks. Other questions, comments? Yeah.
I am Silvia Bente, and I am very happy that Mr. Defren arrived to this conference and to this session, because I came just for this topic. Really, this is my same focus. Actually, I am an example of this brain drain. I am an agricultural economist from Hungary, but I was born in Romania. And I can absolutely support what you said. And I feel that this is a vicious circle in these countries, because the young people who are well educated, they cannot find their place in these economies. Once, because the wages are low. Secondly, because these systems are actually becoming more and more corrupt. And even if you have knowledge and good intentions, sometimes you cannot enter. And because these people leave, there is no one left to change the system. So this remains like that. And I think this is not only the problem of the new member states, but I hear very similar situations in Italy and Greece, that young people have to leave because they just don't have the chance. And actually, it is very, very nice that you remind us that there were already two moments in the history of the EU that the EU had to rethink what is happening, and that we are not finding the solutions. And I think we are approaching a similar moment, that we have to realize that these new member states are just completely different. They are on a different level. And it's like putting into a car race a Lamborghini and a horse carriage, and they will never reach, and then you give the first prize to the Lamborghini, and then he will get again richer. So we will never get there. And I also think that to believe in the market forces, yes, so it's about capital domination. Hungarian and Romanian firms cannot take up the competition with these with German and French companies, and also like how the regulations in the EU are written, are designed from rather the Eurozone perspective. What is fair competition? Because, yes, so as you said, the R&D spending will never, it stopped. And these countries remain on the cheap labor. And even I have examples, a German textile company goes to my hometown, providing the very same wage that the other Romanian company is providing, and there is no change on the local level, but the profit is taken. And actually there are already papers, researchers that find that also in Poland, 50-60% of cohesion policy funding goes back to Germany. So is the EU willing to think about this and investigate what is happening on the ground? Was it the intention that this money flows back to these areas? And also if we look at the simple state aid rules, which are really was written with good intention, to ensure fair competition. But one element is that you cannot support domestic over-imported. But these local economies in Eastern Europe, they have to somehow grow up. But if you cannot support them, then what will happen? So the other thing is the land issue, for example. In Hungary tried, because we have much cheaper land than in Germany or the Netherlands, and Hungary tried to protect the land for its own local farmers, and it was very heavily debated and attacked, and of course you can debate this, but the question is if Dutch farmers come and buy a big portion of our lands, when will the Hungarian farming sector and our rural population catch up? Because then our rural population goes to Germany and to Switzerland to pick strawberries. I don't think this is the equilibrium that we are looking for. So, yeah, thank you.
Thanks for your contribution. There's one there and then one there.
Sorry, it's more like just to follow up on that. My name's Thomas Tischer. I actually work more in international development sector, but cover some areas around energy and post-growth as well. I would just be curious to hear if there are any examples of ways of drawing people back after maybe a generation. I appreciate that doesn't necessarily help during that period, but I remember looking over a Bruegel economics piece that was talking about the positive impacts of migration and then also reverse migration. I recognize that, like I said, it's a long period. And so that would just be interesting to hear your reflections. Is there examples of maybe what's called positive deviation of ways that lessons learned to help despite allowing people for free movement? And secondly, it's interesting, an example of, say, in Eastern Europe, I'm half Czech, and Czech Republic seems to be some sort of golden child, and I'm not exactly sure why, but unemployment is the lowest in Europe. It's basically almost zero in Prague. And there seems to be a very high demand for both expat as well as local jobs. And maybe it's because I've spent more time in the cities than in much of the rural area. So the contrasts are quite big. But it would just be interesting to hear on some of the differences between Central and Eastern European countries and why that is.
Thanks a lot. Then there was another one there and one there. And then
thank you, Jonathan Barth from the Institute for Future Fit Economies in Germany. I was really delighted to hear from you, Mr. Defrange. I'm not French, so I don't really spell it probably correctly. That you go beyond the Ricardian idea of free trade is just always good for everyone. And I think it's a good step the economics does there. When I was back at university, I got still taught the old story. You might know that probably. So I have two questions that still derive from that. So the first one is, what does follow for policy if you have this analysis in mind? And do I understand it correctly that it might actually be that strategic industrial policy is needed to help countries to catch up. Because if you say you have business clusters, then how do these business clusters emerge if you have like no way of protecting any industrial sectors? I cannot really think of any other policy that's possible. And if this is so, and the overall goal of the European Union is to actually foster convergence, what does the European Union then has to do to actually reply to this problem? And I mean, this would probably be a very big paradigm shift in regards to economic policy making. We can see it in Germany right now. There's first voices actually rising who say, okay, we need strategic industrial policy, something I haven't heard for years. So maybe that's just a next step to also move this discussion also to the European level. I would really love to hear what the Commission thinks about this. Thank you.
Thanks. And now we have a last question somewhere. There?
After listening to what you say, I think that what unifies your narratives is the inequalities. And for some of you, it's more social or economical. And to come back on what has been said on this side, I want to know, like, if you consider that we need power either as money or energy, what would be the solutions that are more related to a degrowth than growth? Because whatever happens, we would need money or energy. I was at the energy conference before, and we understand that in the end, it's always nature that will win over money, so energy. And I was wondering, like, what would be your solutions that are more related to degrowth than growth?
Thanks a lot. So we can stop here with the questions and give the floor back to our speakers in order to have their answers, starting by Ms. Gabi Bischoff, because she has to leave. The floor is yours, Gabi.
Thank you. I will just make a short comment, because I think the debate and the question show very well in what kind of situation the European Union is. There is not one thing like the single market not functioning. There is a deeper problem, and it's very much connected. And look, for example, if you look, we discussed the problems of the single market, that it's not balanced, that it's not delivering for all, and also the imbalance between the economic and social rights. On the other hand, it was stressed here very much that we have a European labor market that is not working for all. To put it the other way around, some countries are profiting extremely of it, and others have to pay the price, and this is something that is not sustainable. It does not work, and it is quite obvious now already in many countries, and some examples were given here. I would like to come to the political imbalances we have, and this increased with the crisis. So if you look at the situation, I'm in European policies for more than 20 years, and it fundamentally changed. And I think it's really with the crisis, not because of the crisis, that you really have the dominance on EU policies of some countries. And these are the countries, interestingly, and we saw that profit the most. And this is a problem. If you look, for example, to increase the complexity, this was our criticism from the beginning on the Juncker plan and the investment plan. It's a very good idea that investment will be key, especially for the countries that have to cope up. But in reality, if you look at the countries that profit most from the Juncker plan, it's again the same bunch of countries. And I can say that because I'm coming from Germany, so I'm representing one. But this is not working anymore. And I think, therefore, one needs a coherent strategy. And if you ask for the degrowth, you see the complexity we are in. I think you could easily say, okay, the moment Europe would implode, that would have a big degrowth effect. But I think what you said, for example, and one of the alternatives is, if you look, for example, at digitalization and globalization, mega trends we have, where we all know that we can only shape them in Europe together, because the member states are too small, and as you said, we have to use globalization to set standards. But at the moment, we are not setting the right standards enough. And I think this will be something that is important. And for me, the key is more convergence. So, and for me, this is the very important goal, and it's upward convergent, as it was said, and it's not happening at the moment, and not in a level that is enough, especially in some countries. So I think here it will be key that the European Union changes really their political approach here. So business as usual and continuing like it is will lead automatically in some way or another at some point to a deconstruction of Europe. Because we are already at a level where we have new emerging blocks within the 28, and where it's harder and harder to find common ground on the necessary regulation we want to achieve. And therefore, I think it is very important to see that we need this policy change in Europe. And then Europe will not fall because of the populists. It falls because it doesn't provide the right solutions, and the populists are capitalizing on that. And therefore, this is, I think, the big thing we all have to do, the ones that want Europe and think Europe can provide better solutions to achieve this change, and also to make sure that in the meanwhile people don't turn their backs because Europe is not delivering on the promise of well-being of all the citizens. I'm sorry I have to go, but I only came here because I have another meeting and have to go back to that one. But thanks for the interesting debate.
Thanks a lot. So going back to to revert in the order of the intervention before, now I would give the floor again to Professor Defrene to answer to the question that came from the audience.
Well, if I started by showing pictures of Beijing, it's very likely to show you that the poorest member states are also the most polluting. So when you're talking about, growth, it depends how you define it. But if you don't invest in technology, you're going to pollute more. If Africans don't have technology, they will have more deforestation. They will not be able to adapt to global climate. So when you're saying no growth or degrowth, no, you have to organize growth differently. But if we don't provide Poland and Bulgaria with more and better clean technology, they will continue to pollute and kill their own people. And I think, so in that sense, I think that your vision is a bit caricatural in the sense that it's not because you have degrowth that you're moving towards less pollution. There were less trees in Europe in the 14th century than today. Less tree. Because people would cut down the tree to have their, make their fire. There was more deforestation, exactly like you have in Africa and India. If we provide more efficient technology, like, let's say, for example, nuclear fusion, or if we have cleaner technology than we have today, solar panels, solar energy, I think that it can only be better for the rest of mankind, and this is providing free technology to the countries which are less advanced. And I don't think market forces will do that on their own. But I think the problem is not an absence of growth, but a need to improve technological level to have a sustainable growth. And the humanity can do that today, I think. Now, to answer to your questions regarding, I think you point, a good point also is corruption and instability. If you look at Mexico and NAFTA, you can clearly see that the way that the labor market has functioned and the maquiladoras have functioned to create labor-intensive activities but very low added value of Mexico, in terms of trade and GDP, Mexico seemed to be quite successful in NAFTA. But it has created a much more unequal country where the north is very advanced and the southern states of Mexico are not. And the social inequality is much higher than before, but most of all, the Mexican state is weakening because there is not enough money to pay a civil servant for the last 20 years. That has led to an increased level of corruption and instability. You have 100,000 people who have been dead by mafia in Mexico. It's a large country, it's more than 100 million people. But, if you divide by 10, having in Belgium, 10,000 people dead by the mafia, people will notice. If you look at what is happening in Romania, for example, where because of austerity measures, the government was forced to stop paying 5,000 policemen, I'm just wondering, what are they going to become, these policemen from Romania who do not have a wage anymore? And thinking that if you have member states who are specialized in low-tech and having structural problems like Greece, like Bulgaria, like Latvia, and thinking that will not affect the stability, the political stability, the corruption, it will increase the problem and will lead to probably more brain drain. And southern Italy and the mafia know what I'm talking about. I mean, there is an institutional weakness of southern Italy for decades. Once it's there, it's very difficult to get it out. And I'm very afraid that we are letting corruption and stability and, of course, extreme right sentiment rising in these countries, while actually it's not that costly to sort it out. We have the financial means to sort it out. Now, to discuss Ricardo and because your questions are very linked. Should we have industrial policy to help? Well, if you look at South Korea, if you look at China, if you look at Vietnam, that's what they're doing. And the country who did nothing but left only market forces, I can quote them. Argentina, with Carlos Menem, not really the best example. Mexico has done a lot of privatization and opening to flows, but it had led to a very corrupt model of capitalism where you have some rent seekers like Mr. Carlos Limelu of the telecom companies, which got his business more by government links than actually by technological prowess. So I think that the countries who have managed actually to catch up are often countries who had a state industrial policy. And in that sense, Liszt has proven probably more right than Ricardo in history. But nevertheless, having industrial policy can also be very dangerous, because if you have strategic industrial policy, that leads to more confrontation in the world economy. And we clearly see, I think that Trump response is a response against China industrial policy. And because of the success of China industrial policy. So I'm not saying that it's not an easy task, but I would say that I don't think market forces will certainly enable the periphery of Europe to get out of its status. At the same time, if you would have people believing that by getting out of Europe, it would be improvement, for Greece or Romania, I think it would be even worse. Because if you look at Guatemala, it's probably even worse than Mexico. They're not part of NAFTA. They have CAFTA, but what I mean is they're less integrated Guatemala, but Guatemala has not any better record. So it's not simply by getting out of the EU, it's by having access to technology, and that is much more difficult. And the EU could provide for that, but it needs to have policy that implies financial transfer to provide this technology and to improve the education and the investment in research. And I agree that the Juncker Plan did not do that. The Juncker Plan followed the Marshalling District. Money came where Marshalling Districts were, and this is clearly visible in statistics. So this is why, yes, I think that you cannot leave it to market forces. No.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, Mr. Feldman. Well, I have the feeling that you know much more about trade policy than I do, so this is quite of difficult business to answer to your question. I've done a bit of research on CETA and TTIP, but I was dealing with, let's say, the elements that sort of tried to mimic single market principles. So there was a mechanism, or there is a mechanism that sort of implements the principle of mutual recognition into a trade agreement. And this can be, as I've explained in my presentation, be a problem. I was also more concerned with the issue of democracy. So what effects does this kind of trade policy have on democracy? Now you asked me about which you explained that there are criteria to European trade policy and that CETA does not live up to this criteria. That might be true, and I think the idea of criteria for trade policy is quite interesting, but my first answer would be that trade policy has to be democratized. So if you look at the conflicts that were happening around CETA and TTIP, had all sorts of objectives, but one that became then also visible to the public was the problem of transparency, the problem of can parliaments co-decide or not, and there was some attempts by the Commission where they tried that national parliaments and the European Parliament should not agree, and then there was a judgment of the European Court of Justice which re-established, let's say, co-determination rights of parliaments. And the idea of democratization would be that in a democratic process where political parties, parliaments, but also civil society organizations can give an input, that this would help to create better trade policy. So, but as I said, I'm not an expert, and especially not on the issues you raised. And I think you would find better answers to your questions than I did. So this is everything I can say about this. I would like to say something about something that came up here in the discussion, and this is that there are countries in the European Union that still need some kind of development strategy. Let's think about Greece. Let's also think about different other countries. And I do wonder how a development strategy for these countries can look like under the given competition laws, European competition rules, especially the prohibition of state aid and also public procurement provisions. And I think it might be worthwhile to think about if we recognize that a country like Greece really needs an economic development strategy, so industrial policy, but also, I don't know, investment in public infrastructure, energetic renewal, and all sorts of things. But this should be done in a way that the Greece economy, and with this, of course, Greek companies, Greek workers also profit from it, can hardly be done, for example, if you have public investments, and this has to be publicly procured. So countries all over Europe can apply for it, and the most cheap one wins the tender then. And this is, of course, something that might help to build infrastructure in a country, but does not really build up sustainable economic structures in a country. And I think in this regard, we really have to pay more attention to the fact that we have a very heterogeneous situation between countries, and that unified rules for all might not always be in the interest of all. So competition rules can help competitive countries, especially their companies, but they might also be a hindrance for countries that aspire to become as competitive as other countries. And what you said about brain drain and mobility, I can only say that I really I cannot understand that the solution to economic problems is always or often to be found in people have to become more mobile. If there is unemployment in one country, why don't they move to another country? And this might be also the case because those policies or the solutions are devised of social strata like us, so people that like to move around, people that like to live in another country, and so on and so forth. But my feeling is that not everyone necessarily wants to leave his or her country. I can only speak for myself. I've moved quite around when I was younger, and I did enjoy it. But I'm so happy that I do not have to do it anymore, so that I have settled. And the example is I can, for example, put a screw in my wall because I know I don't have to change my apartment every 3 years because I have to go to another country to find a job or so. So I do think that that this kind of thinking about the divergence or the heterogeneous situation in the EU needs to take into consideration the different situations of different countries, and it might not be always the most obvious solution to just say everything should be mobile and then market forces will fix the problems. It will also create other problems.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up and a bit more just briefly and more closely to your explanations. You talked about the soul of the treaty, of course, the 4 freedoms, and of course, soul is not a legal term. Could you translate your interpretation of the treaties in legal categories like placement or prominence or priority and connected with this fourfold check, Gebhardt formula or something? How is it legitimated legally that, for instance, for an environmental law or something, this extremely rigid fourfold check is done, and maybe if you have an example for environmental policy where this legal check has been implemented and maybe even prevented a legal measure. Thanks.
I also wanted to add a question on what Professor Defren said before, very interestingly, about the beginning of your intervention. You mentioned that the structural funds, the cohesion funds, didn't manage to do what in some federal states was possible to do in order to avoid entire areas of the country, in that case, in the continent, in the Union, in our case, would lag behind. Could you elaborate a little more on that? I'm very interested in understanding why, according to you, the cohesion funds, as they were provided in these years, have failed the important mission to compensate, in a way, the situation.
Well, briefly first, the structural funds are quite limited. I mean, we're talking about the EU budget is about 1% of the GDP, 1.07. If you put the structural fund at their height, represented about 40% of the EU budget at the best time. No, they're a bit lower than that. So you're talking about 0.35, 0.40% of the GDP. If you take the federal state of the United States, or if you take China, they would have between 10 or 20 times the amount to play on financial transfer. The second is that the gap is extremely big. I mean, Alabama is probably one of the poorest member states in the United States. And if you take, of course, Rhode Island, fiscal heaven, or, if you take California, if you take Massachusetts, they're high-tech states controlling a lot of Marshallian districts like Route 128 in Boston or Silicon Valley in California. But the gap is less than 1 to 2. If I am taking Bulgaria compared to Sweden, I'm talking about a gap of 1 to 10 in terms of wages. So there is no such disparity within the United States, not even within China. even if you're considering Xinjiang and Shanghai, yes, you're about 1 to 10, but actually the gap is a bit reduced thanks to transfer. In the EU, we don't have that mechanism, so we don't have enough fund. Second, many of the projects help some countries to develop, especially those who could attract foreign companies. Ireland was very successful by using structural funds to create infrastructure to host American multinationals, thanks to the EU taxpayers. I find that's always very funny. But Czech Republic probably worked better because it was very well located. When they made the highways to Pilsen, you're only 3 hours away from Nuremberg. So to move back labor-intensive activities, it's very easy. And the technological development of the Czech Republic was the highest in Eastern Europe, even during the communist time. They had Skoda, they had the best high-tech of the area with East Germany, probably. So I think that it's very well located. It's got already a very strong industrial structure, but that's not the case for Bulgaria or Latvia or others. If you take, for example, East Germany, they got 3% of the GDP of Germany as transfer. So can you imagine how much they got for so many years? That's how Germany reduced a bit the gap, but not totally. There's still a 20% differential between the Eastlanders and the others. So I think that clearly not enough money, especially for those who are remote geographically, who didn't have the technological base like the Czech Republic. And I think also the problem is also that you have also a path dependency and an interrelation between the lack of development, corruption and instability. If for me Romania is more fragile as a state with more corruption and more criminal organization than the Czech Republic, it's also because they are poor. And if you don't have the level of corruption in Sweden, it's because it's a richer country, so civil servants are well paid. But if I'm looking at how much a Romanian civil servant is being paid, living in Romania, he actually lives very poorly. If you want to diminish this kind of corruption exists in the rich countries. I'm not saying that you have scandals all over the fact. But the common criminalization of some activities of the state, the fact that you have petty corruption to ask for a passport, to ask for an authorization, this is more in countries like Mexico, Morocco, but also the periphery of the European Union. And that is a disincentive for qualified people to stay in.
Okay, so
excuse
before...
me. Here.
Oh yes.
I just also asked the representative of the Commission whether, like, how to deal with this question of industrial policy. I really would like to get your feedback on that as well.
Yeah, I didn't give him the floor yet to answer. Don't worry, he will probably answer to you. But before, I wanted also to make a question to the Commission, if I can. Well, you heard many different views and ideas, also from the question from the audience. It is clear, according to me, that the actual model of development is unsustainable. We might have different opinions on what could be the way forward to get out of this crisis, but I'm sure that also the Commission shares the worries about the current situation and the consequences it is also having in political terms in many different countries. It is undeniable that inequalities have increased, and it is also a fact that even if I'm usually strongly criticizing the proposal that come from your side, one of the fields on which I think the Commission did some good steps forward is exactly the field of tax harmonization, with some proposal on automatic exchange of information, on the country-by-country reporting that would mean, but I'm sure that you know about it, having a system in place that demands to multinational companies over a certain threshold to declare how many profits they do and how many taxes they pay in all the countries where they work. This Parliament has voted with a huge majority for that system to be in place, and not only within the European Union, as it is already in the proposal of the Commission, but also outside. Why? Because looking at the global level, it's a matter that you cannot address only at the European level. Otherwise, you would always be a step backward, because, of course, you can maybe find transparency measure within the European Union, but then we will have a third country just outside our borders ready to be the next tax haven with even more tax incentives and exemptions. So the point is we are doing some step forwards. I think that in terms of referring to the title of our panel today, Single Market, there's in particularly one system that would be fundamental to tackle the inequalities, which would be the common consolidated corporate tax base. Why? Because it would work in a way to make sure that profits are, let's say, taxes are paid where profits are made, which is not something, I mean, it might sound very simple, but it's not. When you take into consideration digitalization, automatization of work, and the thing that this model is, let's say, under attack, I think, by a strategy that is there. It's true that many of our countries, including my country, Italy, has no industrial strategy and has not been having it for decades, I would say, right now. And it's part of the problem. But at the same time, I think one of the main issues to tackle is exactly this. And how can we, let's say, even if you probably disagree with some of the proposals that were made, I know that you're here only, I mean, with your mandate from the Commission, but
Prime Minister.
he would love to be a Prime Minister, and it's also my let's say, I hope you will manage to be one day. But the point is, in front of the criticism you heard, and the problems that we are seeing also from the data coming from the Member States, to what extent do you think that this model could be corrected? With what measures? In which direction? I would be very interested in hearing your opinion on this, and I thank you for being here, because I know it's not easy to be surrounded by people that have very, very different ideas. So the other point that I wanted to make before giving you the floor was mentioned before. We approved, and in the national debates there was no trace of that. We approved a month ago, no, it was more than a month ago, sorry, it was at least 3 months ago, the Posting Worker Directive, a reform of the Posting Worker Directive that goes in the direction to make sure that the same pay goes for the same work in the same place, which is, for example, another important step forward to tackle the unbalanced situation created by the single market law until now. So it means it's true that probably to really address comprehensively all the unbalances, we will have to change something in the treaties, as you were mentioning in your presentation, Mr. Seikel. But I think there is a number of things that we could do tomorrow morning, and it's only a matter of lack of political will by some member states to do and go in the same direction. One last point to answer to your question. Yes, I am sad if you maybe were having different expectations when walking into this workshop. Let me maybe make things clear. This post-growth conference has been organized by 10 MEPs from, I think, 4 different political groups, S&D, ALDE, Greens, EPP, and GUE, together with some organization and ULB, for example, a university. So the aim of this conference was not to, let's say, give an orientation to the debate and give a clear answer to what we think should be the way to address the situation today and the problems that we're facing today, because it would be impossible even to have for us on different political groups the same ideas and proposal on how to move forward. You might know that, for example, I'm part of the group that has different economical perspective and social perspective from our colleagues of the EPP, who are all also involved in the organizing of this conference. So the idea of the post-growth conference was, and maybe the title made you think something else, the idea was to set a framework in which we could discuss putting together what usually you don't see in these rooms of the European Parliament, let's say the orthodox thinking together with what is believed to be not so orthodox. So you have different workshops. This one was focusing only on the single market and who is profiting from the single market law more than others. So probably in other frameworks of the same conference, you could also explore different themes, for example, energy and the problem of renewable energy and the way forward also to address climate change. Yes.
If I can, if I may, I just
quickly because I have to go.
Or if you prefer to speak first, and then I can.
Yeah, sure. Or we can also continue the discussion afterwards.
But actually, I would like to just for the room, because post growth, on the definition of growth, I'll go with the definition of degrowth, because the conversation has been from all sectors, from all parties. How do we get upwards to the level that Germany is living? And from degrowth, the departing point to think of post-growth is if we all live like they live in Germany, we need 5-7 planets. And so I'm just wondering, why are we here talking about how to grow when it's like a cognitive dissonance? We know that we can't grow. That's the point of this conference. And so in the point of this is not where we should going, how should we be thinking different? Even from all sectors, and we're not thinking different. I've heard all of this, and I know that, there's a brain drain and, social inequalities and no fiscal compact and all the things that we hear this every day. I thought this conference was to bring bold ideas, from different quadrants so that we could brainstorm and not just, it has not been about deep growth at all. Zero.
Yeah, again, as I said, you would probably find other discussion around in the other workshop that would complete our analysis. We were trying not to discuss big growth in this conference. We were discussing, I think you heard from many of the speakers, the idea of, let's say, the knowledge that this model of development is unsustainable, and the idea is how to solve the issue. No, I haven't said anything in that direction, but still, we have to give the floor to the last speaker. We can continue this confrontation also outside. Of course, as I said, the idea, maybe the misunderstanding came from the title, but again, I stress the effort of 10 MEPs from very different backgrounds and ideas to make together this conference to give the floor exactly to people having different ideas from ours to go forward and brainstorm. That's the idea. But you are very open, and that's why we... Yeah. I am pretty sure we can discuss after giving the floor to our last speaker to react to the question. But I hope that you will find in the whole of the conference also the answer that you were looking for and the ideas that are more similar to yours. Thanks.
Well, it's not that I want to sound as if I'm extremely eager to speak and I'm going to present solutions for all these issues. Unfortunately, I don't think I'm there. But I think it's been a very interesting and humbling experience for me to hear all this. It's not that most of it's total news. And I'm not going to sort of, seek refuge in saying, I'm just responsible for, and although partly, as to your question on the of course, we don't have the financial firepower of the United States and China, but the Commission now has an industrial policy. There is an industrial policy that speaks about skill policies, that speaks about the interaction with regional policies, the issue of clusters and the issue of two-tier societies. So there are beginnings of replies that are being given to many of the problems I have heard here under the banner of an industrial policy strategy. Then, as far as a few other comments that were made, Mrs. Bischoff is not here anymore, but she said that the idea that when the Commission says that we're doing less in order to do better, I don't think that that should be interpreted as a classical deregulation move, but it's more thoughtful regulation. I think that in the past there was often a tendency to a certain sort of activism that you need to produce, and now the emphasis is more like, well, think before doing something. But I don't see this as necessarily a tonality of deregulation. Also, I mean, it was interesting to hear Mr. Seikel's presentation of the test for how can you assess the proportionality and necessity and mutual recognition. And I think that from a research, from a research perspective or from a university perspective, if you look at principles like mutual recognition, necessity and proportionality, that this might sound super effective. We destroy all contrary regulations, the regulation that is more permeable to free trade. I mean, I can tell you that it's far more complex than that. The fact it's not that difficult to demonstrate that your law is necessary. It's not that difficult to demonstrate that what you want to achieve is proportionate. I think that the Commission is in its enforcement of the free movement rules is quite considerate about non-economic rationales that might prevent free movement. And to be honest with you, I mean, the impact assessment we have produced in the goods package shows that mutual recognition is not working very well. That's why we are. So, I mean, this whole idea that you import a chair from Bulgaria into Portugal based on Bulgarian law and the Portuguese market surveillance inspector immediately, brilliantly understands everything the Bulgarian law says, don't focus too much in the model, but in the way the model is applied. I mean, I can tell you that from an enforcement perspective, what you described as sort of like a steamroller to destroy regulations that promote issues like health, safety, environment, etc. I think that the picture is far more nuanced than that. No, sorry, because I have to get back to my phone where I have the issues I'd like to. So the question on services. I mean, the legal model based upon which the free movement of service operates is different from the free movement of goods, which makes it, I mean, to make a long story short, that it's much more easy to bring a product from Germany to Greece than a service from Greece to Germany. And what can be noted is that all legislation aimed at furthering the free movement of services is being subject to much more political resistance than that on the free movement of goods. If your competitive asset is industrial products, you're probably better off in this moment than if your competitive asset is your cheap, efficient services. And I think that. But I mean, it was an extremely interesting experience for me to be here and to hear all of you. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. So I think that we are closing more or less in time. I thank all the speakers for their availability once again and for your contribution. I thank also the Commission for being here and answering to the question, and I thank all the present that have contributed to our discussion with their questions and also their comments. Thanks a lot. Have a good day, and don't forget that there are, the program is still going on today, and I think, today is still, Stefano, a che ora finisce oggi? At 6. Okay, so not today, but tomorrow there will be other workshops on other very crucial issues. Thanks a lot.